The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. Mr Chairman, it's very interesting to be here tonight, and it's a day in this House where we are enjoying the maiden speeches of new members across the House, and over the last couple of days we've been in the ceremonial phase of the opening of this new Parliament. And for those of us who've been here a few years, a few terms, it's always a welcome time because it's a very human time. We mix as MPs, we celebrate the talent and the experience that people bring to the House from across the chamber. And then we come to this bill. This is really the first substantive piece of legislation that the government has put before the country. And here all of the camaraderie, the parliamentary process and the chivalry, if you like, is put aside, and we come down to the differences between that side of the House and this. Because, you know, it doesn't matter what you call it, at the end of the day, the National Party represents the interests of capital, and the Labor Party represents the interests of Labor. Clue is in our name. The clue is in our name. And it's in our colour too, which has got a bit of a history to it. But the clue is in our name. And debates like this lay bare the age-old struggle between the interests, so-called, of capital to drive down labour costs by any means necessary, and the interests of workers to bind together to protect the basic minimums. And here is the thing, that the historical economic evidence shows that capital left to its own devices actually eats its own young. Because in the 1990s, when the National Party last tried this despicable trick through a thing called the Employment Contracts Act, and we suffered through it for a decade, the cost was evident in two dimensions. Firstly, Mr Chairman, in human misery. We saw a rapid widening of the gap between rich and poor. We saw a rapid increase in poverty. We saw a rapid increase in the diseases of poverty, a growing child poverty problem which is still with us, sheeted home to employment law changes like this that eroded the situation of those who work hard but don't earn a lot. But here was the second effect out of the Employment Contracts Act. Labour productivity declined. Why? Because it created an incentive for capital to substitute investment in machinery, tools, training and productivity-enhancing investments for cheap labour. That's right. For cheap labour. And what happened as a result was that labour productivity declined in New Zealand and started to get away ahead of us in Australia. The Employment Contracts Act, measured in terms of its human impact and measured in terms of its economic impact, was a failure. Enter the Clark-Cullen government. The Employment Relations Act, which this bill amends, sought to find a sensible middle ground. It did not go back towards awards or compulsory unionism or some of the arrangements that predated the Employment Contracts Act. What it did do was to put in place obligations of good faith bargaining and a reasonable set of minimum protections. And that is what we are here today to watch the short-sighted National Party attempt to remove. Pillar by pillar, brick by brick, stone by stone, they are tearing down the temple of decency and building instead the ramshackle structure of the short-term self-perceived interest of capital. So some examples. Let's get out of the clouds and down to the grassroots. Let's take Part 6A. Let's talk about some real people, like Melly Taveti, a Wellington cleaner who colleagues will have mentioned has been cleaning the same premises for 20 hours a week for 17 years. And so what happened was, when Melly's employer changed because the contract was sold to a small company, they told Melly that she had to have her hours radically reduced. She was only working 20. She asked to be paid out. She refused to take the lower hours, and Part 6A protected her so she could get reasonable compensation. Under the law as amended by this bill, she would have got nothing. So somebody who's done nothing wrong after 17 years, earning a minimum wage or close to it, loses the most basic rights because the naked interests of capital have driven the government. Mr. Chairman, that was my first call, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
The Honourable David Cunliffe, but I do want to warn members now we are on a committee stage.
So on Part 6A, which is contained, Mr. Chairman, I recognise your guidance, sir. Part 6A is contained in Part 1. And as we go back into Part 6A, Mr. Chairman, the amendment removes the protections which apply to workers who are contracted out. That's right. So nothing changes for the worker except that the ownership of the business changes and the new owner uses that as an excuse to erode their terms and conditions. And the sad fact is this is most often to be used against the lowest paid and most vulnerable workers. It is wrong. It is just wrong. It is unethical. It is unsensible from an economic point of view, and it is wrong, Mr. Speaker. Let's move to another of the provisions, rest and meal breaks. As we went around the country during the campaign that we've just had, this was iconic. It was the ACT Party's support that was withdrawn that prevented this bill going through before the election. It was withdrawn because the member concerned was on his way to the slammer and was no longer able to be a member of Parliament. That's why this bill didn't get through before the election. This is a kind of Conservatives' dream. Imagine a provision which is already flexible, Mr. Chairman, which is to allow something like a minimum 10-minute rest break and a minimum half-hour lunch break on a flexible arrangement to be agreed mutually between the boss and the worker, all gone. All gone because the naked interests of capital played out through the National Party and its little subsidiary brand, whatever his name is over there, that is vested in this piece of legislation which takes away the 10-minute smoko break. Workers around the country get this. It's something that belongs in a Charles Dickens story. It takes us back to sweatshop economics. It takes us back to 19th century labour law, Mr. Speaker. It is a ridiculous, shameful thing to do in the 21st century. Mr. Speaker, this part also removes fundamentally the duty to conclude collective bargaining. Now, the idea here is good faith means two sides negotiate and both sides have an obligation to reach a conclusion. Doesn't mean they have to agree, doesn't mean that either side has to give in, but they both have to sit at the table and talk their way through the problem till they get to a compromise or a standoff, which then is referred to arbitration. Not now, Mr. Speaker, not now, because this bill gives the employer a scot-free, get-out-of-jail card. Let's walk away. Spray and walk away. That's what this bill permits. Gone is decency, gone is the fair middle ground, gone are the privileges that have been hard fought over the years. And Kiwis out there will know that on the first legislating day of this, the final term of this government, they chose to break through the camaraderie of the parliamentary process and remind every single New Zealander that they are here to do the bidding of the bosses. They are here to pursue the naked interest of capital against the minimum decencies that have been hard fought for Kiwi families. That's the reality of the 2014 election. This piece of paper, first up, the Employment Relations Amendment Bill, the Take Away the Smoko Break Bill, the Get Out of Jail Free, Spray and Walk Away, Gone is Good Faith Bargaining, remove the protections for the most vulnerable. I'm reminded of a passage in the Bible which says, to those who have much, so will more be given. But for those who have little, even that which they have will be taken away. Well, Mr. Speaker, hey presto, it's taken away in this bill. National should be ashamed of itself, except they have done New Zealand a favour. They have just told us what they are really about. And we are not going to forget it. And this Labour Party is going to take the fight to those craven cronies of capital for the next 3 years so that New Zealanders have a real choice and can do what is right, decent and fair, which is throw out this pile of rubbish and give ordinary New Zealanders a fair go.
Dr. Jian Yang.
I move that question be now put.
Right, just can people just settle down? I am going to take another call, but I do want to remind members again, this is a committee stage for debate about specific clauses in the bill or in the amendments. Jan Logie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and congratulations on your appointment. I do look forward to what you all bring to the role. And I just, before I get into it, I want to speak quite substantively